we want to always remember that no matter what our titles or authority may be, that it is God who is in control and that we function at the will of God, and He's in control and we're not in control. There's a lot of talk about what I deserve or what I worked for or what I did, and all of those things are good, but at the same time, it's important to remember that we wouldn't have anything, do anything, or be anything if it were not for God. And we want to always function in the will of God. We don't want to have a sense of entitlement when it comes to salvation and the Word of God and the work of the Lord. Again, we are working to please God, and we are working to draw people to Christ. And that's all that really matters. And as always, it's such a pleasure to present to you the Sanctuary Sunday School, powered by the Sanctuary Academy. And I apologize if there's an echo on the audio. I'm actually on holiday. I took a much needed break for Mother's Day weekend. As you know, this is my first Mother's Day without my mom, and I needed to just be away from everything because it got a bit heavy. But I thank God for strength and just for sustaining me. And I thank God for just this global celebration of motherhood. I thank God for being a mother, and I thank God for the wonderful mother that He blessed me with. So I'm going to go ahead with the lesson, which is elected by God. And I was just thinking about, this was an election year. Well, last year was the election year. And here in the U.S., we inaugurated a new administration. And when you think of all of the turmoil that the election took us through and all of that campaigning and things, and it's just a blessing to think about the way that God does things, right? And when He has elected us or you, there is no recount. There are no injunctions. There is no challenges. Well, if there is a challenge, you know that it's unfounded. But God's election is sure. And that is something that we can stand on. We can take it to the bank, as they say. So when we see here, Paul is addressing Israel. And Paul was Jewish. He was part of the Israelites. But he also was a member of the Sanhedrin Council. So Paul was very well educated, and he was really a high power figure before he was converted to being a prisoner of the Lord, which also meant that he physically spent time in jail. So he was talking about his people, Israel, and he was talking about how a lot of times, your own people don't accept you, and that's what was going on, how they were struggling to accept Christianity. And he was saying, these are still my people. And he said that, God forbid that the word of God had no effect. He said, that's not it. He said, all of them are not going to be lost. He said, but at the same time, they don't automatically have a right to salvation without living right. So like you said, he said the fathers, it's through them that we have Jesus on the natural side. He came down through their flesh and blood. So they can lay claim to him, but he said, but also they've got to live a life, and my dad used to tell me all the time as a pastor's daughter, he would say to me that you don't have a monopoly on salvation. You got to live right just like everybody else. And as a matter of fact, I used to feel like they made it harder on me, than everybody else. Everybody else could be late for church. I couldn't be late. The other people didn't have to come to Sunday school. I had to come to Sunday school, but it's that which has me here where I am today, and I'm grateful for that. But this is what Paul was telling them. You're not going to automatically make it in without doing the work. But at the same time, God would never forsake his own people. It's there for all of us. And so that's what he was talking about when he was talking to the people about being elected by God. And then he even went back to the lineage. And that's one thing that I always mention when I'm talking about the Israelites or the children of Israel, because the Jewish nation, they knew their history, and he went back and he talked about Sarah, and he talked about how God chose Abraham to have the son through Sarah. And then, Isaac was their son, and then he talked about Rebecca. And then Rebecca had the twin boys with Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and how, Isaac loved Esau and Rebecca loved Jacob, and she despised Esau. And he was talking about how the customs for the Jewish people was that of the oldest child would receive the blessing. And so he said, well, in this case, the older is going to serve the younger in this particular case. And that was Jacob. And Jacob is the one whose name was changed to Israel, who had the 12 sons, which made up the nation of Israel. And so this is what he was saying. He said, now God chose Jacob to be the one to use to have these nations. Now, you can't go back and question and second guess what God did, because as Paul is saying here, God is God. God can use whomever he wants for whatever he wants. And we've got to learn that, because sometimes, or we've got to understand that, because sometimes we have people that we feel should be in a position, or somebody we may feel doesn't deserve something. But God makes that decision, and he picks and chooses whom he wants to. But he's still fair, and he's still just, because he's always made a way for all of us to have salvation. And that's what we have to focus on. We have to let God handle his business and then do what he told us to do, and not worry about what he gave somebody else. And so this is what Paul was telling them, that no matter what happened, who's who, what's what, you've got to live right. And so he was talking about God's election, and he even talked about Pharaoh back in Egypt, how God used Pharaoh to deliver his people. Because if you go back to the book of Exodus, it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And he did that so that God could be glorified, because see, Pharaoh thought that Egypt was the end all be all, and Pharaoh deemed himself a god. So God said, okay, I'm going to show you who God is. And so they said, just like a potter on a potter's wheel, the potter takes the clay and he creates whatever he wants to create. And that's just a lesson, even for us. And this just dropped in my spirit. Sometimes you struggle, there's this thing when I teach on the secular side, on the business side, about imposter syndrome. And I've suffered with it, where you feel like you're unworthy, or you can't have this, or you're not good enough to do this or that. But God, right? God has the ability and the power to mold you into whatever he wants you to be. And get this, at no point on that potter's wheel does the clay look up at the potter and say, you know what, I don't want to be a cup, I want to be a bowl. Or, no, I don't really want to be a bowl. Maybe maybe you could break me down and make me a saucer or a plate. The clay has absolutely no say so. And just here, sitting in this hotel room, God just dropped in my spirit complete surrender. We are at God's disposal. If we just surrender like that clay and allow him to make us. One of my favorite songs, the Spirit of the Living God, fall fresh on me, make me, mold me, use me, fill me. Spirit of the living God. It's not always about what you want to do, what you want to be, what you want to have. It's what God would have for you to be. And I guarantee you that what God has for you is better than anything that you can even imagine, ask, or think. Now I just went off on a whole tangent, because that just got good to me right there. But elected by God. When you have been chosen, when you have been elected by God, he is the greatest, which means he has the greatest plan for your life. And this is what Paul was trying to tell them. He said, stop worrying about all this other stuff and who's who and what's what and Israel and yeah, we honor Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the fathers, but you got to live here today. Okay, Abraham did his job. He was named the father of the faithful. He was the father of many nations, and Abraham has been resting a long time ago. You can't get nowhere on what Abraham did. Yes, you can learn and you can follow his example, but you've got to serve the Lord. As my dad would say, every tub, old Southern thing, every tub has to sit on its own bottom. So, yes, God gave us a mind and He gave us a free will. But it is in your best interest to make sure that your mind and your will is always in alignment with the will of God.